Every kid has heard the phrase, "an elephant never forgets." Nobody ever explains why. It just gets repeated until it stops sounding like a claim and starts sounding like a fact. Here is a story that actually puts it to the test. In March of 2012, a South African conservationist named Lawrence Anthony dies of a heart attack. Within 2 days, a wild elephant herd he rescued years earlier, one that has not set foot near his house in over a year, is walking through the bush to reach it. Hour after hour, nobody leading them, nobody who could have told them what happened. They arrive. They stand near the property for 2 full days. Then they turn around and leave the way they came. Nobody can prove what those elephants understood, or whether understood is even the right word to reach for. But something in a 5-kilogram brain, carried across real physical distance, without a single human instruction guiding any part of it, decided this mattered enough to act on. So is the phrase actually true? Let's find out what is really going on inside that brain. The obvious explanation is the brain. It always is with elephants. Elephants have the largest brain of any land animal on Earth, close to 5 kilograms, 4 times heavier than yours, folded with more wrinkles across its surface than a human brain has. Surely that means an enormous memory center sitting inside it. A biological vault, custom-built for storing a lifetime of faces and places. That is the story most people settle for. It is also, according to the most careful anatomical study ever done on an elephant brain, not quite right. In 2014, a research team led by neuroanatomist Nina Patzke at the University of the Witwatersrand dissected and mapped the hippocampus, the brain structure most associated with memory, in real elephant brains, slice by slice. What they found broke the simple version of the story. The elephant hippocampus is not some oversized memory engine. In proportion to the rest of the brain, it is fairly ordinary. Typically mammalian, in the researchers' own words. Slightly larger than a human hippocampus in raw volume. Sure, 10.8 cubic centimeters against 10.2. But elephants are enormous animals, carrying an enormous brain. Relative to brain size, nothing remarkable. Nothing that alone explains a lifetime of near total recall. So if the memory center itself is unremarkable, something else has to be doing the heavy lifting. And there is something else. The temporal lobe. In elephants, it is disproportionately huge, stretched, and expanded far beyond what you would expect for a brain this size. Roughly a third of total brain volume, nearly double the human proportion. Nobody fully understands why evolution built it this way. But it sits right next to the hippocampus, feeding it constantly. And somehow, between the two of them, something extraordinary is happening. Here is where it stops being anatomy and starts being genuinely strange, and where the story stops being about brain tissue and starts being about what that tissue is actually used for out in the world. In 2001, researcher Karen McComb and her team ran an experiment in Amboseli National Park that is still cited constantly today. They played recorded lion roars to wild elephant family groups through hidden speakers and simply watched what happened. Some roars came from a single lion, a manageable threat. Others from 3 lions roaring together, a genuinely dangerous one. The elephants reacted completely differently depending on which recording they heard, bunching together defensively and moving toward the sound for the group roar, staying noticeably calmer for the solo one. That alone is not shocking. Prey animals read danger constantly. Every species does it to some degree. Here is the part that actually mattered. Groups led by an older matriarch, in her 40s or 50s, reacted correctly far more often than groups led by a younger one, still in her 20s or 30s. The older females had simply heard more lions over more decades of living. They had built, somewhere in that oversized temporal lobe, a working library of exactly how dangerous each specific kind of roar actually was. Younger matriarchs, without that library, got it wrong more often, sometimes bunching up over nothing, sometimes failing to react to something that genuinely warranted fleeing. Knowledge, stored for years, deciding in real time whether a family lived through the night calmly or fled in a panic that might not have been necessary at all. If that sounds like a controlled experiment proving a point, here is what happened when reality ran the same test without asking permission, with real calves and real consequences instead of a speaker system. In 1993, Tarangire National Park in Tanzania went through the worst drought in 35 years. Food and water collapsed across the region. Calves started dying. Researcher Charles Foley tracked 21 elephant family groups through the entire crisis, watching to see who moved and who stayed. Some groups left the park entirely, traveling well outside their normal range to distant water sources most of them had never personally visited. Others stayed inside the park boundaries, close to what they already knew, and struggled through it. The groups that left had one thing in common, and it was not luck. Their matriarchs were old enough to have lived through the last drought of comparable severity, back in 1958, 35 years earlier, when they themselves had been young enough to remember exactly where the family had gone to survive. Old enough to still hold the location of resources nobody currently living in the group had ever personally used. The calves in those groups survived at dramatically higher rates than calves in groups led by younger matriarchs with no memory of that earlier disaster to draw on. Not instinct, not a lucky guess. Instinct would have sent every group running in the same direction, toward the same familiar waterhole that had always worked before, the one that was now dry along with everything else in the park. A specific memory, older than the drought itself, carried quietly for over 3 decades through droughts of ordinary severity that never required it, activated the moment it finally was needed, and it saved lives that would otherwise have been lost. Go back to that herd, walking through the bush to reach a dead man's house. Nobody can measure exactly what happened in their brains that day, and probably nobody ever will. But whatever it was not unprecedented. It came from the same species that remembers the specific danger level of a lion's roar heard decades earlier. The same species that remembers a drought from 35 years before it happened again. Memory, showing up once more, this time in a context no laboratory ever designed, and no researcher was standing there to record. Just a herd, a house, and 2 days nobody can fully explain. So is it true? Do elephants never forget? The honest answer is more interesting than a simple yes or no, and considerably more specific than the phrase ever gave them credit for. It is not one flawless memory system storing everything forever, no biological hard drive with infinite space. It is an unusually large temporal lobe working overtime, an ordinary but well-used hippocampus doing exactly what hippocampi are built to do. Decades of specific survival-relevant information held carefully by the oldest members of a group and passed down through nothing more than proximity and time. And apparently, on top of all of that, something else, something that walks for hours through the bush toward a house it has not visited in a year, for reasons no laboratory has fully mapped yet. Call that memory if the word still fits. Call it something else if it feels too small, too clinical, too much like a filing cabinet to describe a herd standing silently outside a house for 2 days before turning around and walking home. Either way, somewhere out on the savannah right now, an old matriarch is standing at the edge of her family, carrying information nobody else in the group has, information nobody taught her, only lived through, waiting to see if she will ever need it again. Statistically, one day, she probably will, and when that day comes, an entire family's survival may quietly depend on something she has been carrying, unused and untested, for 30 years, in a brain that was never quite as simple as the phrase made it sound.